Hello, Eco and Adventure Tourism. We made it. We are in Module 7. In this quick video, I'm just going to go over the test, how it is, some of the main points that we're going to cover so that you guys are ready and prepared. I hope you enjoyed this class so much. I loved having you guys. And I wish you guys good luck on your test. As soon as we're done, I'm going to email you with the grades and let you know how everything is going. So this test is going to be open until next week. You have 70 minutes to take it. It is 20 questions and it covers module 4 to 7, so the second part of the semester. Okay, so the first thing we talked about that is going to be on the test is we talked about quality control. So we talked about quality control in sustainable tourism. We looked at certification of agencies, of hotels, how that works, right? I talked about criteria and indicators. And I also talked about that even in certification, we can actually be greenwashing, right? If we pay somebody who will give us a label, right? That would be greenwashing in certification. So how do we avoid that? We go through a process of certifying the certifier, and that process is called accreditation. So just remember that there's accreditation, which is certifying the certifier, and then the certification agencies that actually do give the eco label to the hotel, the operator, and so on, right? And a lot of times, as we mentioned, we have criteria in the 3 main pillars of sustainability. So we have the sociocultural, the environmental, and the economic pillars, right? That we all measure indicators. Perfect. So that's accreditation. We also talked about carrying capacity and limits of acceptable change, right? With that, we talked about that one of the main things that we really need to do for limits of acceptable change, and really in any of the management frameworks, is we need to monitor the resource. We need to figure out what changes are happening, what impacts are happening, so that we know what's going on, where those impacts are happening, and then how can we actually manage that, okay? So monitoring the resource is really important. How we monitor the resource, if there's a question on the test, just remember that a lot of times we have a control site, a site that isn't touched at all, so we can control what's happening where we have tourism and where we don't have tourism, right? We usually use it in any of the management frameworks, right, where there's an environment such as environmental tourism, right? And usually there's rating scales or measurements where we can look, right? I gave you guys this whole lecture about monitoring. Just go back to that page. But basically we look, okay, like we gave the example of the trail, right? What's going on? Is the trail now wider? We have measurements and rating scales for that, okay? Along with the monitoring, what we also do is we usually look at a baseline. So we need to know where are we starting from? What's our baseline where we monitor that change from, right? So a baseline basically helps us to measure where change is happening, right? And where we set that baseline, again, really depends on what we're trying to do. And remember, we got into this whole discussion about sometimes that baseline could be 100 years ago, or it could be 50 years ago, depending on what we're trying to do, right? So just keep that in mind. The baseline doesn't always have to start in the now, right? Okay, we also talked about education interpretation in that last part of the class. And so I want you guys to really look at that. And we spend a lot of time looking at interpretation. And interpretation really is such a key part of nature-based tourism, adventure, and ecotourism, right? It is actually one of the defining characteristics of ecotourism. And so interpretation basically means that we do more than just educating. We give ideas and examples about a theme of what is going on in that ecosystem, in the environment, right? And so interpretation needs to be something that really sparks the interest of the tourist, right? Something where they want to learn more. It's usually around the theme. It's usually almost like a scavenger hunt where you go and you learn a bit one thing, another thing, right? And so on. And one of the key examples that we gave is a visitor center where you have different displays. However, it could also be signs on trails, it could be movies, it could be brochures, it could be websites. So interpretation can happen through different things. So just remember, interpretation, very key central element of ecotourism, and that it's really important, okay? We also talked about that anytime we have tourism and the environment, and we develop ecotourism, we really need to include the local community, right? I gave you guys many examples of some of the early parks in Africa, some of the wildlife reserves where local communities were shut off, or actually in the beginning even moved, right? They were moving them from where they were. Like if they were establishing a nature preserve, they would literally move the local people and put them outside of the park area. And that has never worked. So what we now know is to include the local community in tourism planning. And also, remember we talked about it, the community needs to benefit from it. What good is tourism development if the local people don't benefit, right? This is obviously philosophically for them, but also for natural preservation. We know that if we really want to preserve the resource, we need to have the buy-in from local people. So local people need to be included, right? We also talked about in that same module about community-based tourism. That is tourism that is established from the bottom up instead of the top down, right? How tourism is normally developed. So just remember that. Just remember community-based tourism and involving the local community is good because of conservation, because it actually, remember that article I gave you guys, it actually helps have a better tourism product as well. So I give you guys the example of the Kenya wildlife tourism, right, where it was actually a better experience if there was a cultural component, even if the actual tourist attraction was wildlife tourism, right? In this case, safari tourism. Now, we also talked about community-based tourism, that community-based tourism fails 80% of the time. And I talked to you guys about some of the reasons why. So some of the reasons why it fails is market access, right? I mentioned this in the video. Go look back on the video if you want. But market access, that they don't have access to the tourism production system, right? To that links to an outbound, inbound operator, and you as a traveler, for example, how does a community reach you guys, right? We talked about also financial viability, that in order to really make enough money from community-based tourism, we would have to offer almost a mass amount of tourism, and that is just not viable. And the last thing is governance, right? That it needs to benefit all people. So if there's only a small percentage of families, for example, benefiting, or if people don't have the skills, or not all of them want it, you can already see so many issues that can happen, right? And so governance really is the third aspect of why community-based tourism fails 80% of the time. Okay, carrying capacity and limits of acceptable change. Carrying capacity basically means how many people can fit in a certain place, right, before the place has changes. There's consequences, right? So we talked about there's a social aspect, there's a biological aspect, right? But it's basically ecological and biological factors, and it really has to do with the site. Limits of acceptable change, on the other hand, is a management framework that asks how much change are we willing to accept, right? And it's a 9-step process that basically looks at the baseline, like I just mentioned in this video, right? We look at the baseline, we monitor it, we look at what changes are happening, how much change we're willing to accept, and then based on that, we manage and figure out what we do. Is that closing a trail? Is it closing a campsite? Is it putting limits of use, so not allowing people to go in the park in such big quantities, so on, right? We also talked about a lot of the impacts of tourism on local cultures and communities, right? So I mentioned economically, leakage and multiplier. So just look at that. Multiplier means that the same dollar that we're spending is getting multiplied in the community. Leakage means your original dollar leaks out of the community through either export or import leakage, right? Either we have to import something, or actually a foreign owned company is operating in our destination and the money leaks out that way, right? We talked about commodification, which is basically turning something into a product to be sold. In this case, it would be culture, right? So think about, for example, the luau's in Hawaii where people are dancing, right? So selling your culture through arts, through dances, through singing. We talked about inflation and resentment as well that can happen. That's a sociocultural impact, right? Inflation would be an economic one. And we talked about staged authenticity, which is basically where we are putting our culture for sale through commodification and pretending something is real and authentic when it's actually not. And so one of the examples would be tribal tourism, where, you know, maybe the tribes actually already wear jeans and they wear t-shirts, but when the tourists come, they're putting on their grass skirts and they're pretending they still wear, those old clothes. So just think about that. Okay. Then in terms of management strategies, we talked about site hardening, which is anything we do to the site to increase its carrying capacity, right? So we talked about on the coral reef, that could be putting mooring balls so that the sailboats or the dive boats don't have to throw their anchor and destroy the reef. On a wetlands, it could be building a boardwalk so more people can walk there without trampling and destroying the resource, right? But one of the main things that I want you guys to take away from that, remember we talked about that even if we increase carrying capacity through this site hardening, we have to keep in mind that the wildlife around that site hardened trail or whatever is still not allowing thousands of people to pass by. Think about a monkey or a bird there, that's still going to impact them. So we have to keep that in mind. Site softening, on the other hand, is anything that we do to restore the sites. So we talked about coral restoration, we talked about replanting things, replanting trees, hedges, and so on. So that is site softening, right? We also talked about protected areas. And we talked about that there's really a concentration of use, and that was the 95-5 rule. So that means that within protected areas, a lot of times, and we talked about that in the ecotourism lecture as well, right? Tourism is really highly concentrated in only 5% of the area. And that also goes for the amount of parks. You might have a lot of parks in the country, but really tourism only visits just a small sample of those parks, right? And that's really the main things. I hope that helped you guys. Again, good luck on your test. Reach out to me with anything. I hope you really enjoyed this class. I loved having you guys. Have a wonderful time and see you guys later. Ciao.